who sent Marcus Garvey to jail in his famous case in 1923 was Julian Mack. And Julian Mack wasn't only a Jew, he was also an influential member of the NAACP. At the beginning of the trial, Marcus Garvey and his lawyers asked Judge Mack to disqualify himself. Here was this man who was a member of the NAACP, which had been waging a campaign against Marcus Garvey, the Marcus Garvey Must Go campaign. Members of the very same NAACP had written, right around the time that Garvey was indicted, they had written a letter to the Attorney General of these United States, telling him that Garvey was a criminal, asking him to put Garvey in jail and or deport him. And here you had a representative of that very same organization sitting now in judgment over Marcus Garvey. And as Brother Ilombe said earlier, not only was Judge Mack a Jew, he was also a leader of the American Zionist movement. Over the years, many misguided people over the years have called Garvey a quote-unquote Negro Zionist. Nothing could be further from the truth. If Garvey was a quote-unquote Negro Zionist, then the Zionist judge would have let him off. You had a rare Zionist judge giving Garvey the highest possible fine, the longest possible term of imprisonment, and as if that wasn't enough, then charging him the entire costs of the trial, which was about 10 times the maximum fine. So that was a rare Zionist now dealing with the person who they call a Negro Zionist. And if you ever wanted any proof that there was nothing Zionist about Garvey's organization, here is the proof. During the Civil Rights Movement, especially the early phase of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, early 1960s, the Jewish claims to liberalism again came to the fore. The Jewish historians now tell us that something like 75%, they say, I have no reason to argue with them, they say that something like 75% of the funding for the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, for SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they now tell us that something like 75% of the funding for those organizations in the 50s and early 60s was coming from Jewish sources. 75%. They're now telling us that Martin Luther King's most influential advisor was a Jewish man by the name of Stanley Levison. They're now telling us that Stanley Levison drafted Martin Luther King's speeches. I suspect he must have drafted his books as well, because if you look at Martin Luther King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, you find a very strange attack on what he calls black anti-Semitism. So it might very well be that Levison must have helped draft that book as well. We are now told that Levison was in charge of King's finances. We are now told that Levison was King's quote-unquote chief strategist. So here you had an incredible position of power and influence in the black civil rights movement. And much of what has happened in the last 20 years in Jewish-black relations can be explained around the question of that incredible power and influence which the major Jewish organizations had during the early phase of the black civil rights movement. Because what happened when the black power movement came into being in the middle 1960s was that the black power movement, without necessarily focusing on Jews per se, but the black power movement, just because it insisted on self-determination and self-reliance for black people, it began to look critically at the role of white people. And again, I'm not aware that the black power movement focused in on the white people as Jews, but they began to look at the role of alien people and the incredible influence which they had within our movement. And the black power movement, thanks to people like Carlos Cooks, people like Malcolm X, people like Stokely Carmichael, now Kwame Ture, H. Rap Brown, that whole generation, Assata Shakur, that whole generation, that black power generation began to say the time had come. As Marcus Garvey said in his famous essay on African fundamentalism, the time had come for us to take control over our own affairs. And so without necessarily targeting Jews as Jews, the black power movement, insofar as it expelled white people from the movement, automatically struck a very severe blow at that incredible Jewish power which had developed within the civil rights movement. And my suspicion is that once the Jewish establishment realized from the mid-60s on that they could no longer direct the black struggle from within, they seem to have taken a strategic decision that the next best thing was to try to destroy it from without. And so from the late 1960s on, you find a whole string of incidents bearing out my thesis. You had the Ocean Hill-Brownsville business back in 1968 in Brooklyn, where the Jewish teachers and the Jewish community generally destroyed the efforts of black parents to control the curriculum of their own schools, to control the education of their own children. You had the Baki case, among other cases. The Baki case is the most well-known of several court cases. In the Baki case, it was 1977, where you had a white man in California challenging the whole concept of quotas for black students in medical school. The case didn't involve Jews. The major Jewish organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress, they inserted themselves into the case. The case didn't concern them. They voluntarily entered the case as so-called friends of the court to argue, to file briefs, and to argue against the concept of affirmative action quotas for black people. Here you had major Jewish organizations representing Jewish people who today are the recipients of perhaps the largest reparations in history. The Jewish state of Israel has received billions of dollars in reparations from Germany over the last few decades, billions of dollars. And here were black people struggling to maintain the absolute minimal reparations, a few quotas in medical school. And here were the recipients of the world's greatest reparations in history, entering into this Baki case to destroy even that little modicum of reparations that black people were getting via a few little extra places in medical school. You had the Dubé case, which Milombe mentioned earlier, at Stony Brook, where the South African professor gave his class a series of essays. One of the essays was Zionism as racism, which at the time was a very topical question. It was being debated. In fact, the United Nations, I believe, actually passed a resolution to that effect. It was a very topical academic issue at that point. All the man did was to insert this among a whole list of possible essay topics. The result, he lost his job. You had the case of Andrew Young in 1979, the darling of the integrationist, traditionally pro-Jewish establishment. And even Andrew Young fell victim to Jewish wrath in this period. Andrew Young was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Here was a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations trying to mediate a problem between Jews and Palestinians. And he decided, as any rational person would do, that the only way to mediate a problem between two people is to talk to both of them. He had a meeting with the PLO. The result was that he lost his job. Around the same time that Andrew Young had his meeting with the PLO, a Jewish U.S. ambassador to Austria, a man named Wolf, also met with the PLO. Did he lose his job? No, of course not. He was a Jew, he could do what he wanted. Andrew Young was judged by a different standard. He wasn't supposed to do what the Jews didn't like, even though the Jews could do what the Jews didn't like. But Andrew Young, as a black man, couldn't do what the Jews didn't like. You had the ongoing situation of Crown Heights. I recall, and I'm sure everybody here in this room is much more familiar than I am with the case. I think it was in the 70s where the young black man was killed by Jewish vigilantes in Crown Heights. Of course, we had the more recent situation in Crown Heights again over the last couple of years. Even Nelson Mandela was not exempt from Jewish wrath in this period. When Nelson Mandela came here to New York in 1990, on Ted Koppel's Nightline show, I distinctly recall